Richard Dawkins, the atheistic biologist, once said, "The 5 proofs asserted by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century don't prove anything and are easily, though I hesitate to say so given his eminence, exposed as vacuous." Richard Dawkins was one of the biggest leaders in the new atheist movement that occurred around the mid to late 2000s. Though the new atheist movement has somewhat died out, these objections to theism still plague the world. Today I'll demonstrate that in reality Richard Dawkins attacks a straw man conception of Thomas Aquinas' argument from motion. To start off, Richard Dawkins gives his false conception of the argument from motion. He states, "The unmoved mover. Nothing moves without a prior mover. This leads us to a regress, from which the only escape is God. Something had to make the first move, and that's something we call God." Dawkins' first objection to the argument from motion is that all 3 of these arguments rely upon the idea of a regress and invoke God to terminate it. They make the entirely unwarranted assumption that God himself is immune to the regress. It's important to understand that we are talking about a hierarchical or derivative causal chain of motion or change. Aquinas is not saying that this causal chain of motion takes place over a linear period of time, like a series of dominoes, for example. He's arguing that objects in existence have something that keeps them in existence at any moment, and are therefore dependent on this first mover in this sense. Aquinas would argue that in this derivative chain, which is a chain of dependency, you cannot have an infinite regress. To give Aquinas' analogy, a rock will not move from a stick pushing it, even if the stick is infinitely long. The stick itself has no derivative power to do so. You need something other than the stick, like a person, to provide causal power. The only way to terminate the infinite chain is to have something which is moved by no other, or using metaphysical terms, is purely actual and has no potential to change. This unmoved mover is purely actual and can actualize the whole causal chain, but is not itself actualized because it has no potential to change. I've covered this concept more in my previous videos on Aquinas. Dawkins continues with another objection and states, "There is absolutely no reason to endow that terminator with any of the properties normally ascribed to God: omnipotence, omniscience, goodness, creativity of design, to say nothing of such human attributes as listening to prayers, forgiving sins, and reading innermost thought." In reality, it actually follows from this unmoved mover being purely actual and having no potential to change that he has attributes of what we know of as God. For example, he would have to be omnipotent because he has the power to actualize all things and to keep all things in existence. This unmoved mover would also have to be omniscient, because according to the principle of proportionate causality, all material things, for example, would have to in some way be in God, or in this unmoved mover. But this unmoved mover, or purely actual actualizer, would have to be immaterial, because matter has potential to be moved or changed. So the only way for material things to be in the unmoved mover is if they are in him abstractly. And if they are in him abstractly, then he would have to have a mind. Finally, he would have to be an omniscient mind, as he cannot lack knowledge that he can gain later, as he has no potential to do so because he is purely actual. Now, with regard to Dawkins' objection that the argument for motion doesn't prove God listens to prayers or forgives sins, the argument does not claim it does so, necessarily. The argument is to prove that there exists an unmoved mover who moves all things, and this we know of as God, as he bears the attributes of God. It does not argue which specific God this proves. To that, Aquinas would appeal to divine revelation or scripture. Finally, Dawkins states, to return to the infinite regress and the futility of invoking God to terminate it, it is more parsimonious to conjure up, say, a Big Bang singularity or some other physical concept as yet unknown. Calling it God is at best unhelpful, and at worst perniciously misleading. This very objection against Aquinas from Richard Dawkins is a clear straw man of Aquinas' argument for motion. As stated earlier, when we talk about causal chains, we are talking about a hierarchical or derivative causal chain, not one which takes place over time and leads to a first cause or first mover in this sense. Aquinas never thought that you could philosophically prove that the universe had a beginning and time, but he did think that you could prove that it, and even specific things in it, could be shown to be dependent on a first mover. Richard Dawkins, though he is a biologist, has for some reason stepped into the field of philosophy. The majority of his objections fall under a straw man conception of the argument for motion, and it's a shame that many people in general seem to take his interpretation seriously. The Catholic philosopher Edward Feser once stated that Dawkins wouldn't know metaphysics from Metamucil. Thank you for watching, and God bless.